African police services will be working with private security to maintain law and order during Monday's planned national shutdown. During the civil unrest experienced in July of 2021, the private security industry supported police to protect lives and property. However, there were also challenges in that the private security industry was not sufficiently resourced and trained to react to the situation. So what happens when the South African police services meets private security? Well, Eldred de Klerk is a comparative policing and social conflict specialist and a senior associate at the African Center for Security and Intelligence Praxis. He joins us now for more on this. Thank you very much, Mr. de Klerk, for your time this morning. I think we spoke to Brigadier Atlinda Mate, who speaks for the police, and she did, in fact, say that the police will be working with private security. What should that tell us?
Well, thank you, Dudu, and thank you for raising this particular question, because as you rightfully cited, what we saw in July of 2021, or 2020, when was July? In July, about a year ago, we saw chaos. And what we would hope is that the police just don't make a declaration that they're working with private security. Private security have no more powers than you and I as ordinary citizens. So when they get enrolled in the police plan, what we are entitled to is to say, how do they fit into that plan? What is the perceived role of private security? And if that's to protect the assets, property, and persons where they're already deployed, if that's to ensure that police are timelessly reminded or alerted to where things are escalating, if that's to ensure that they act as a deterrent to protect property and persons, and if that's to ensure that they share information timely so that strategies can be adapted and tactics can be flexible and personnel and resources can be moved around, then tell us that. There's nothing wrong with the police telling us and taking us into their confidence to say how the private security, who's exceptionally well resourced, they outnumber the South African Police Service by far. How do they fit into the plan of NETJOCS? This is what we need to be taken. Actually, we need an explanation as South African citizens.
Yeah, you speak of private security being exceptionally resourced and outnumbering the police by far. Perhaps let's expand on that, and you can tell us, if you will, about private security in South Africa. How would you characterize it?
Well, private security in South Africa claims to be very well trained. And this is a claim they made when it came to firearm training, and there's no need to necessarily dispute that. Private security, in terms of its mission creep, already looks, feels, and acts as if they are private security, but not just private security, but private policing. They talk of SWAT tactics. They talk about, rapid deployment. They use the kind of insignature. They even have the kind of uniform that makes them feel as if they're a private military or private policing entity. And this is very dangerous because it's already difficult for you and I to distinguish between police uniforms, and now to even distinguish between uniforms and vehicles and regalia that has the feel of a legitimate state national police. Private security numbers have said to be around 800 to 800,000 personnel at any one time. It's very difficult to know because private security companies close, they get assimilated into other private security entities. Not all of those those private security officers are necessarily on patrol and doing guard duty. They're also doing protection of assets. They're doing cash in transit. So they play in a number of different roles. Some of them are private bodyguards, for example. They have armaments that basically puts the police armory to shame. And as we saw with Fees Must Fall in the student protests, they even started taking on a crowd control function. They came in with armored personnel. They had shields, and they took the posture of public order police, and they had paintball guns, and they engaged the crowds of students who were protesting. This is not a function that they qualify for, and it's questionable whether they've been trained for this function. So the mission creep of private security adds to the agenda of those who say that, firstly, we need to decentralize police and we need to privatize police. Next, we're going to privatize prisons, and we already have private security playing a very intrusive part in our lives through its surveillance capability. Most of our surveillance cameras that are out there in the public, that information accrues to private security entities. We don't know what they do with it. We don't know how long they store that information, and we have no idea at what point do they delete that information. So there's too many questions when it comes to the questionable role of private security as it is. So it's incumbent on the South African Police Service to make very clear who has the liability for private security overreacting and being anxious, because there's enough. You've already reported on the concern and the fear and the ominous call for shutting down the entire country that generates a state of panic in most of us, for our business, for the safety of our persons, our loved ones, and our property. So if private security overreacts, who's liable for that? How are they accountable for the actions of private security individuals? Does this justify the vigilante action that we see by private citizens thinking then that they have a right to protect their property, but can they then take to the streets and say that they're going to protect the neighborhood? South African Police Service have to make sure that they clarify what role, a specific role do they see private security play, and that the onus is on private security operators to ensure that they abide, respect, and uphold the law.
Eldred, I'm hearing, please do correct me if I'm wrong, you spoke of the privatization of policing, or possible privatization of policing. So what, is this now a deliberate act to not stave off crime or to get a handle on crime in the country? Because one would naturally suggest, or one would naturally link that, and I'm not entirely sure if there's evidence to link the high crime rate and hence we having, more private security, because now people would rather pay for that service because there is a lack in terms of the police doing their job. I'm not even sure if I'm articulating that correctly, because the mere thought of privatizing the police is scary.
Absolutely, and in certain cities, and I speak particularly, I'd say, the city of Cape Town, where we have a de facto private police entity by having private security guards police our streets in the city. That's a concern. We have barricaded and restricted access to certain neighborhoods. That is a policing function, and it's now being fulfilled by private security. We have we have cameras, surveillance all over the place. We have number plate recognition system. We have heightened patrol by private security entities. The assumption is that works. There's always, for those of us who work in the security sector, the illusion of security. When private security fails, it then falls to the South African Police Service, who have to serve both those of us who pay for private security, and I have an alarm system and I pay for an alarm company to monitor that alarm. When that alarm system fails, or my private security company cannot respond quickly enough, it falls then to the police to continue to protect me, because they serve all of us, whether we can pay for private security or not. Nobody ever turns around and says, that's a failing of private security. Malls, for example, are heavily guarded by private security. When there's a mall robbery, or when gunman goes in there, the first question is, where were the South African Police Service? Yes, that's private property. So the South African police have to protect those of us who pay for private security, and protect me, even though I pay for private security, and every other citizen. So maybe we should reinvest that money into bolstering the South African Police Service, bringing it into the 21st century, professionalizing it, bolstering its numbers, paying more on our taxes, for example, and ensure that we get a professional, competent, well-structured police who we can hold publicly accountable. Because the thing to do about private security entities is they're not publicly accountable for what they do, nor are they publicly accountable for the failures, which we don't really quantify as much as we quantify the failures of the South African Police Service.
With that then, should there be cause for concern that private security will be involved in Monday's operations?
Well, not really. Because they've been, the label given to this is that the South African Police Service is what they call force multiplier. And what we mean by that is that each entity should do what they need to do. Traffic should do what they do because that's their competency. They should ensure that roads are clear, that there's a traffic flow, and that they manage the movement of goods, persons, and services, for example. Where private security is being deployed for the protection of property and persons and fixed assets, they should have a plan in place. They should have a clear line of communication with the South African Police Service, and they should understand their powers under the given circumstances. Has not been heightened up. We're not in a state of emergency when it comes to giving them extra powers under the Criminal Procedure Act, for example. But they are a great source for alerting the police to an escalating situation. They could be a possible and potential deterrent, because somebody may say that target has been hardened. There's competent, seemingly well-resourced, disciplined private security in place. Let's not go and engage them because we already committed ourselves to a peaceful protest. So private security needs to continue to do the functions under the law that's been given to them and the responsibilities they've accepted. In that way, they free up the South African Police Service to hopefully respond to hotspots, to facilitate and manage the protest, and work with protest organizers to ensure, who now recognize, because of two court judgments which you so clearly articulated during your show, that they will be held responsible should things go awry. That frees up then the deployment of private security to do their job, the deployment of traffic to do their job, and any other disaster management services, emergency services to do what they need to do. It frees the South African Police Service to play a much more proactive, facilitative role in working with protesters to ensure that the protest is peaceful and unarmed.
In the work that you do as a security expert, KwaZulu-Natal alone, we heard from the police there saying some 18,000 police officers will be deployed. The Police Minister, Bheki Cele, was speaking about helicopters being deployed, boots on the ground, the SANDF being on standby, private security is here. In the line of work that you do, is this an appropriate response?
It's very difficult to tell, because if nothing happens and Monday happens peacefully, then some of us may argue that it was an overreaction. We cannot tell. The threat has been determined, and this is an appropriate response that the South African Police Service have crafted. We don't know what the overall strategy is, and we definitely don't know what the strategic objectives are. If the strategic objectives of NAD joints and NAD jocks is that what they want to do is ensure that people have the right to protest, that those who protest will do so peacefully and unarmed, and the South African Police Service and all its entities are committed to work with them, tell us that. Tell us also that what they want to do, because this is what we have heard, that they want to work with the protesters to ensure that those of us who cannot, for example, stay away from work, maybe those of us who are in essential services, doctors, nurses, teachers, and students going to school, for example, of those who provide key critical transport infrastructure and movements of goods and services, they want to work with the protest to ensure that those can continue. Tell us that. Tell us also that they may facilitate clear and open spaces for people to give expression to their right to protest. Tell them where those are, and also tell them where are areas that they would not want to let them go into because they are key infrastructure, there's key highway and transport nodes. Tell us that. So what we have is that we have utterances and declarations. Declarations, utterances are not reassuring. Telling me that I don't have to worry is not reassuring. What we need is a coherent, functional plan where all actors are committed to the same outcomes and goals and each understand their peculiar role. That is what we needed. And in that way, force multiplier, the idea of everybody doing what they need to do because it's within their authority, responsibility, competency, and mandate, that then becomes something that will make sure that Monday doesn't go awry.
Eldred de Klerk is a security expert. Thank you very much for your time this morning. More news for you in a few minutes.